The night my world split apart did not arrive with thunder, or fire, or even warning. It came quietly, like a sudden silence swallowing the noise of an already fragile life. Silas Boone, the man whose hands had built the beams of our home, whose back had carried the endless grind of survival, whose breath was the only rhythm I trusted when sleep finally came, fell. And when he did, everything inside me fell too. People said he was strong, but strength is never enough when life decides to remind you of its cruelty. They said he could carry more than any man, grind harder than any worker, endure longer than the rest. But they did not see what I saw. The bruised past he never spoke of, the silent pain he never admitted, the way his shoulders folded inward when no one watched. He was a man of resilience, yes, but also a man who carried scars invisible to everyone but me. He was my anchor in a world that felt like abandonment had been written into its foundation. The day Silas collapsed, I was only a few steps away. I remember the cracked sidewalk under my shoes, the city noise muted by distance, the sharp echo of my name leaving his mouth as his knees buckled. His face, usually so stubborn, so unshaken, betrayed a vulnerability I had never seen. The ground took him with a kind of violence that should have shaken the earth, but the world around us kept moving, indifferent. Streetlights blinked their hollow glow, cars rushed by, strangers stared and then looked away. No one recognized the collapse of my world in that single fall. I screamed his name, but my voice was swallowed by the vastness of a city that has no time for grief. And in that moment, I realized how fragile trust is, how quickly it can vanish. When the person who held all your broken pieces suddenly lets go. I tried to shake him awake, whispering promises of healing, begging him for a second chance, bargaining with any unseen power that might be listening. But his silence answered me with a finality I could not bear. Grief does not announce itself like a guest at the door. It crashes into you, violent and uninvited, stripping you of balance. I was left with the echo of Silas Boone's fall, replaying like a cruel record in my mind, reminding me that the man who had carried everything could not carry himself anymore. That night I held his body as though holding it tighter might undo the collapse, as though love itself might rewrite the truth. But truth does not bend for love. Truth is merciless, and so I was left with the silence of absence, a widow in a city that did not care, a woman who fed her strength into a man who was no longer there to return it. Vulnerability became my only companion, loneliness became my shadow, and abandonment became the ground I walked on. The fire of life did not die with Silas Boone, it turned toward me, demanding that I become something I had never been ready to be. But his fall was not the end of my story. It was the wound that opened everything that would come next. I thought the fire would die with Silas, but it demanded me instead. In the weeks after his fall, I fed it not with wood alone, but with grief, with silence, with the pieces of myself I no longer recognized. The fire was not only a flame in a hearth, it was the fragile spark of survival in a world that had already taken too much. At night, the apartment felt hollow, its walls stretching into endless echoes. The penthouse that once seemed like a dream of luxury had become a prison of emptiness. I lit the fireplace because silence was unbearable, and the flicker of flame became the only proof that I was still alive. Every log I placed into it felt like a prayer, every ember a confession, every spark a memory I could not kill. Feeding the fire became ritual, a rhythm that kept my hands moving when my heart wanted to stop. Loneliness is a cruel teacher. It strips you bare, forces you to confront the shadows you buried in the corners of your life. I felt Silas everywhere, in the cracked sidewalk outside, in the diner where we once sat across from each other in silence that felt like intimacy, in the mirror that now showed me a woman I could not recognize. I stared at my own reflection and saw the lines of pain deepening, the eyes hollowing, the lips whispering words only the fire would hear. Vulnerability bled into every gesture. And yet, somewhere inside the ashes, there was resilience. It was faint, like a letter hidden in a drawer you almost forget to open, but it was there. I fed the fire because I could not abandon the symbol of what Silas had built. He had spent his life grinding against the world, and now it was my turn to grind against loneliness, against silence, against the temptation to let the flames go out. The city outside glared with its neon lights and luxury cars, but inside my apartment the fire became my secret second chance. It whispered to me of forgiveness. Not for him, he needed none, but for myself. For every time I believed I could not go on, the fire asked me to heal, slowly, painfully, in the way embers heal after being crushed. Every night I sat by that fire, and every night I swore I could hear Silas breathing in its rhythm. I trusted it more than I trusted people. I confessed to it more than I confessed to anyone. It became my unspoken connection, my quiet transformation, my faceless companion. But the fire was not only mine. I did not know it then, but every flame I fed, every ember I kept alive, was a signal. It was reaching beyond me, out into the shadows of the city, calling someone I had not yet met. One night, as I stared into the fire, whispering my grief into its heat, I felt the weight of eyes not my own, not the city's faceless stares, not the pity of strangers, but something older, deeper, watching. The firelight danced on the walls, stretching shadows into figures that felt alive. I told myself it was loneliness playing tricks on me, but deep inside, I knew something was moving toward me, and soon, the fire I thought was my only companion would summon a rider from the shadows, a rider who carried not comfort, but a command, a rider who would change everything I thought I knew about surviving. Every night the firelight betrayed me, casting shadows that felt alive. I thought the fire was my companion, my only source of warmth in the absence of Silas Boone. But as the nights grew longer and the wind pressed against the cabin walls like an unrelenting hand, the flame revealed things I did not want to see. Shadows lengthened across the floor, twisting into forms that seemed to breathe. They leaned close as if listening to my thoughts. They whispered in the silence between the crackle of wood, and I found myself staring too long, certain that if I blinked, they would move. Isolation does not whisper gently, it screams in subtle ways. Every creak of timber in the cabin became an intruder's step. Every gust against the roof felt like claws dragging themselves closer. The wilderness around me was vast, and in it I heard the rumors of predators. Wolves prowled beyond the tree line, their howls piercing the night with reminders that death waited just beyond the safety of flame. Some nights I thought I heard footsteps, not the four-legged rhythm of beasts, but the uneven tread of men. Raiders, perhaps, men who sought firelight as a beacon of weakness. My heart quickened at every imagined noise, until I could not tell what was real and what was born from grief. Loneliness is not quiet. It grows loud inside you, louder than any storm. I tried to still my thoughts, to trust that the fire was enough to ward off dangers, but trust was fragile now. A fabric torn open by Silas's fall. Vulnerability spread through me like smoke, filling my chest, clouding reason. I began to doubt even the walls I leaned against, as if the wood itself might split under the weight of shadows pressing closer. On one such night, when the wind rose and the fire sputtered low, I pressed myself against the window, straining to see beyond the tree line. The wilderness stretched endless, faceless, indifferent, somewhere out there. Wolves moved in silence. Somewhere out there, men with hunger in their eyes could be watching, waiting for the fire to dwindle before they struck. I fed another log to the hearth, telling myself the light would protect me, though I no longer believed protection was possible. Fear is a slow suffocation. It does not kill quickly, it erodes you. I felt it eroding me each night, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. My body was alive, but my mind was cracking, splintering like dry wood. I caught myself speaking aloud, whispering to the fire, to Silas, to no one. "Do not leave me here," I said once, though I did not know to whom I was speaking. Not like this, not in silence. Then, one night, the silence shattered not with a wolf's howl, not with a raider's cry, but with something deeper, rhythmic, heavy against the earth. At first I thought my heart had betrayed me, inventing sounds as it often did in panic. But the noise grew louder, undeniable. Hoofbeats. The ground trembled softly with each strike, the cadence steady, certain, carrying the weight of someone who belonged to the wilderness in a way I never could. I froze at the window, unable to breathe. My first thought was danger. Who would ride this late toward a widow's cabin? My second thought was desperation. Perhaps the world had finally come to collect what little I had left. The hoofbeats slowed as they neared the tree line, the sound spreading into the stillness like ripples across a pond. The fire inside me both flared and faltered, torn between the need for warmth and the dread of being discovered. And then I saw it at the edge of the tree line, framed by the pale light of a reluctant moon, a figure on horseback. His outline was cut sharp against the shadows, unmoving, watching. Not wolf, not raider, not stranger in the way the city breeds strangers. Something else entirely. I gripped the edge of the window, my breath clouding the glass, my pulse racing with the knowledge that this moment, whatever it was, would fracture my solitude forever. And from the tree line, a rider emerged, not enemy, not stranger, but something else. His name was Yahola, and he carried history in his eyes. I did not know it at first. I only saw a man, dark against the moonlight, moving with the patience of someone who did not fear the silence that had nearly undone me. But when he drew closer, when the firelight finally revealed his face, I felt as though the shadows that had haunted me were retreating, making space for something older, heavier, a presence that demanded recognition. Fear was my first instinct. I pulled back from the window, heart pounding, whispering to myself that he was danger. He had to be. Men who came unannounced to a widow's fire did not come with kindness. They came with hunger, with greed, with violence. My hands shook as I reached for the iron poker by the hearth, the closest thing to a weapon I owned. I braced myself, whispering Silas's name, though no echo answered. When Yahola dismounted, his movements were deliberate, not hurried, not reckless. His horse exhaled mist into the night air, stamping lightly against the frozen earth. But Yahola placed a hand on its neck and it stilled. He moved as if even the wilderness respected his presence. I hated how calm he seemed, how unafraid. It reminded me too much of what I had lost with Silas. The knock did not come. Instead, Yahola stood before the cabin, silent, the firelight casting his features in harsh relief. His eyes were deep, dark, carrying not curiosity but recognition, as if he already knew the story of my grief before I spoke it. That was what unsettled me most, not the threat of violence, but the suggestion that he could see the bruises beneath my skin, the scars I thought were mine alone. "Why are you here?" My voice cracked when I spoke, brittle as the kindling stacked by the hearth. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied me in the silence, and the quiet stretched until I wanted to scream. Silence is unbearable when you carry grief. It feels like a mirror turned inward. Finally, his voice came, low, steady, carrying weight, because you are not meant to endure alone. I wanted to tell him to leave, to retreat back into the shadows he had emerged from. I wanted to tell him trust was a luxury I no longer possessed, that my life was already cracked open by loss, and I could not risk another blow. But his presence carried authority, not the authority of force, but of truth. Every movement he made carried dignity, as if the ground itself yielded beneath him. His silence was not emptiness, it was full of history, of memory, of unspoken connection. I did not yet understand. I distrusted him, yes, but I could not deny the way his calm pressed against my chaos, the way his steadiness threatened to unravel the distance I had built between myself and the world. We stood in the firelight, strangers bound by circumstance. My fear pressed me backward, but something older than fear urged me not to look away. I felt the beginnings of a slow, faceless attraction, not of romance, but of recognition. A bruised past meeting another bruised past, two scars brushing in the silence. Then Yahola spoke again, and his words felt older than the fire itself. He did not speak of himself, but of us. Endure together. Those were the first true words Yahola gave me, and they landed with a weight that pressed deeper than my grief. Not a question, not a request, not even an introduction. It was as if the fire itself had leaned forward and spoken through him, reminding me of something I had forgotten, or perhaps something I had never truly known. I stared at him, unable to respond. My instinct was to resist, to raise walls as I had done every day since Silas Boone fell. I wanted to say that I was enduring had I not survived the nights of silence, the wolves in the distance, the shadows that mocked me. Had I not fed the fire with my own breaking body, keeping it alive when everything else had collapsed. But Yahola's words cut through my defenses. Endure together, not endure alone, not endure in silence, not endure by clinging to what was gone. Together, the word together, felt like an intrusion. It was dangerous, because togetherness was the very thing I had lost. Silas had been my together, my anchor, my other half in a world that always tried to pull me under. And when he fell, the idea of togetherness died with him. I had rebuilt myself around absence, shaped my days around solitude, carved my survival into something that required no one. To be told otherwise was not comfort, it was insult. You don't know me. I spat, my voice trembling between anger and fear. You don't know what I've lost. Do not speak to me as though my wounds are yours. Yahola did not flinch. He did not argue. He stood in the firelight as though my rage was nothing more than another gust of wind, another branch snapping in the distance. His silence was infuriating. It was also disarming. This is not about knowing you, he finally said. It is about knowing what keeps us alive. Alone, the fire dies. Together, it endures. His words carried something older than comfort. They carried the weight of memory, not his alone, but of an entire people. I heard the echo of generations in his voice, the Chickasaw wisdom that survival is not an individual act, but a collective one. He was not giving advice. He was delivering law, spiritual law, a command that had outlived wars, migrations, abandonments, and griefs larger than mine. But I was not ready. My grief was still raw, my pride still sharp. I wrapped myself in it as a shield. I don't need you, I whispered, though the fire betrayed me by trembling at my words. You already called me, Yahola replied. His eyes shifted toward the flame, then back to me. Every ember you fed reached into the dark. You did not keep that fire alive for yourself alone. You may not know it, but you asked for this." The accusation struck deep. Was it true? Had my desperate clinging to flame been more than survival? Had it been a cry for help I did not admit to myself? Vulnerability swelled inside me, threatening to drown me. Trust was a foreign word, one that stung my tongue when I tried to taste it. But the way Yahola spoke, calm, unhurried, carrying weight that felt older than any fear I had known, it unsettled me because some part of me believed him. I wanted to retreat, to bury myself in bitterness, to prove him wrong by surviving harder, colder, alone. Yet even as I tried to deny him, I felt the truth pressing in. Endurance was not only about surviving storms, but about choosing not to break in silence. Still, pride is a cruel master. I tightened my jaw, turned from him, and fed another log to the fire with a violence that was more confession than strength. Yahola did not stop me. He let the silence breathe, as if giving me the dignity of resistance. But as I watched the flame consume the wood, I realized something terrifying. If the old command was true, then my survival would demand more of me than feeding fires and burying grief. It would demand I open the door to another, risk trust again, risk my heart, risk my pride. And that I was not sure I could do. But to obey the old command, I would have to risk my heart and my pride. Silas's death left behind more than grief. It left me his unfinished burdens. The day after Yahola spoke those words, I woke to the weight of them pressing against the ordinary grind of my survival. Hunger gnawed at me. The woodpile was dwindling. The silence in the cabin felt heavier than stone. Even the air carried a judgment that I was failing to hold what Silas had carried so long. Grief is not just absence, it is debt. Debt to the memories, to the promises unfulfilled, to the work left undone. Silas had been the grinder, the one who bent his back to labor, who carved survival out of a world that never gave freely. Now all of it fell to me. The debts unpaid, the chores unending, the grind without relief, the firewood that never lasted, the meals that grew thinner, the nights where silence pressed harder than hunger. I wanted to honor him by carrying it all, but every task became unbearable. My hands blistered on the axe he had once swung effortlessly. My body ached beneath loads he would have lifted without thought. Each failure cut deeper, whispering that without him, I was not enough. I could endure grief, but could I endure the daily grind of survival? Alone, it seemed impossible. Yahola watched me struggle. He did not interfere at first, though I felt his eyes on me, measuring the distance between my pride and my breaking point. I chopped wood until my arms gave out. Pretended I could carry burdens that were too heavy. He let me fight against myself, let me wrestle with the ghost of Silas, until the struggle became humiliation. Finally, one evening as I dropped an armload of logs short of the hearth, Yahola spoke. "You are not dishonoring him by accepting help. You dishonor him by pretending you are him." The words burned worse than fire. I snapped back, my voice sharp with pride. "I don't need saving. I can carry it. Can you?" His tone did not rise. He asked it as though he already knew the answer. Tears threatened me then, but I swallowed them. To weep in front of him would be to admit defeat. I turned away, clutching my pride as if it were the last shred of strength I had left. But later that night, as I sat before the fire, the truth clawed at me. Silas's burdens were not mine alone, not because I was weak, but because no one was ever meant to grind through life alone. I thought of Yahola's command again, endure, and together and felt its sting more deeply. Pride kept me alive, yes, but it was also suffocating me. Still, I resisted. Pride is a cage you build yourself and lock from the inside. I could not yet hand Yahola the key, but I knew, with a fear that shook me, that soon the weight would crush me if I did not. Soon, I would learn endurance weighs heavier than pride. The fire that once kept me alive now threatened to consume me. Winter came down like a judgment, harsh and unrelenting. The storms did not ask permission. They arrived in violent bursts, tearing through the cabin walls, rattling the windows until I thought the glass might shatter. The snow was merciless, swallowing paths, burying what little remained of the garden, and sealing the world in silence even deeper than grief had. My fire, the fire I had once called my salvation, became a hungry mouth that demanded more than I could give. Every night I knelt before it, feeding wood as though feeding pieces of myself, and still it begged for more. Each log I burned felt like a prayer wasted, each ember a reminder that survival was a race I could not win alone. Supplies dwindled. The woodpile shrank faster than my hands could replenish it. My body ached from the relentless work, the chopping, the carrying, the gathering through snow that reached my knees. I was not built for this kind of endurance. Silas had been, but Silas was gone. And yet, I refused to admit defeat. Pride still clung to me like frostbite, numbing, killing slowly, convincing me that surrender would be worse than death. I told myself I could hold the burden, that I could feed the fire and feed myself, though I knew both were lies. It was Yahola who broke the cycle. Where I staggered beneath weight, he carried it with ease. Where I faltered, he steadied. He walked into the storm as if it were nothing but another test of will, disappearing into the white silence and returning with armloads of wood, or game caught in traps, or herbs I did not know. Grew even in the cold. He moved with a knowledge older than maps, older than fear. I watched him, and against my will, I began to trust. Yet trust is never simple. It comes tangled with resentment. Each time he set a bundle of wood by the fire, I burned with humiliation. Each time he returned with food, I tasted bitterness with every bite. My pride screamed that I should do this myself, that Silas would have done it, that to lean on Yahola was to admit weakness. But my body betrayed me the warmth of the fire he fed, the fullness of the meals he provided, the strength in his silent presence. They kept me alive. The fire became a test not just of endurance, but of our wills. Would I cling to pride until it destroyed me, or would I yield to the old command he carried, endure together, and let the fire belong to both of us? Nights grew longer, storms heavier. I found myself listening for his footsteps outside, the crunch of snow, the thud of wood against the pile. His rhythm became part of my survival, though I never admitted it aloud. We rarely spoke, yet silence between us felt different from the silence of grief. His silence did not empty me. It steadied me, but the fire did not relent. One night, the storm screamed louder than any before. The wind clawed through the cracks in the cabin. The snow piled against the door. The fire fought for breath. I fed the last log we had, and still the flames dimmed. Shadows swallowed the corners of the room, reaching toward me as if eager for the end. I pressed my hands near the embers, whispering Silas's name, whispering Yahola's command, whispering anything at all to keep myself alive. And in that moment, as the flames dimmed to near nothing, I felt my soul flicker with it. In the half-sleep between life and death, I heard voices I thought gone forever. Exhaustion carried me into a restless sleep that night, curled beside the faint glow of the fire. My body was numb, my heart heavy, and I no longer knew if I was alive or only dreaming survival. In the quiet of that liminal space, I felt presence surround me, Not Yahola, not the storm outside, but something older. I saw Silas first, not as he was in death, but as he had been in life, broad-shouldered, weary-eyed, with hands cracked from labor. He did not speak, but his gaze carried everything: regret, love, a plea I could not decipher. Behind him came faces I barely remembered, ancestors whose names were whispered to me in childhood but had long since faded. They stood in silence, their presence a chorus of memory, their eyes heavy with recognition. "Why are you here?" I asked, though my lips did not move. The silence answered. It was not punishment. It was not haunting. It was guidance. I felt it in my bones, a reminder that I was not the first to endure loss, not the first to carry burdens too heavy, not the first to face nights that seemed endless. Their presence was not to terrify me, but to steady me. Yet fear still pressed close. What if these voices meant I was slipping beyond life? What if this was not guidance but a final farewell? I reached for Silas, desperate, but his form faded like smoke. I cried out, waking half to the sound of my own sob, half still trapped in the dream. The fire had grown stronger, fed while I slept. Yahola sat nearby, silent, watching the flames as though they too carried voices. When he saw my tears, he did not ask. He only spoke, his tone calm but firm. "What you saw is not death calling you. It is memory teaching you." I shook my head, refusing. It felt too real. "They were here. They were watching me." "They were," Yahola said, "but not to take you, to remind you. To endure is to carry them with you, not to be carried away." His words broke something in me. I had feared the visions were hauntings, punishments for my anger, my failures, my inability to keep Silas alive. But Yahola reframed them: not curses, but blessings, not loss, but inheritance. I sat by the fire for hours, staring into the flames, searching for the faces I had seen. They did not return, yet their weight remained, pressing on me like hands steadying my shoulders. The fire no longer felt like my solitary burden. It felt like a bridge, connecting me to all who had fed flame before me, to all who had whispered their grief into embers. Still, fear lingered. Guidance is not enough to keep a body alive. Memory does not chop wood or hunt food. I clung to the warmth, but I knew warmth alone would not save us. The storms would not cease. Supplies would not replenish themselves. Fire, memory, ancestors, all of it meant nothing without action. I looked at Yahola, his face lit by firelight, calm as always. He did not press me, did not tell me what to do. He only waited, as if endurance itself was patient. But patience would not keep us alive. I realized then, memory alone could not save us. We would have to act. I had sworn never to return, yet Yahola led me back through firelight. For so long, the village had existed only in memory, a place I carried like a scar I refused to touch. It was not just a cluster of homes, not just a circle of fires. It was where my identity had once lived, where Silas Boone and I had tried to carve belonging out of a wilderness that had no mercy for the weak. When he fell, I tore myself from it as though retreat could protect me. I thought solitude was strength. I told myself that by leaving, I could bury grief in silence, let the world forget me as I tried to forget it. But grief is not forgotten. It waits, heavy and patient, like embers beneath ash. When Yahola insisted we return, I resisted. My pride clawed at me, warning that to step into the village was to step into judgment, into pity, into whispers that would measure my weakness against Silas's strength. Yet I could not resist forever. The storms had stripped me bare. My fire had nearly died, and Yahola's command endure together had burrowed so deep that even my bitterness could not smother it. We set out at dawn, the snow crunched underfoot, the world gray and unforgiving. I looked back once at the smoke rising from my cabin, the lonely fire that had been my sole companion, and felt as if I were abandoning a friend. But Yahola did not look back. He moved steadily, as if each step was ordained, as if the earth itself had been waiting for us to follow its path. I trailed behind, fighting the instinct to turn away, to run back into solitude. The village appeared first as smoke on the horizon, many plumes rising together, weaving into the sky like braids of endurance. As we drew closer, sound followed the clang of labor, the chatter of voices, the laughter of children. It was not silence. It was life, collective life, a chorus of survival. I realized then how much I had missed it, even as I had cursed it in my absence. And then came the eyes. The moment we stepped past the boundary, faces turned. Recognition spread like a spark through dry grass. Some faces softened with relief, others hardened with suspicion, still others twisted with pity. I heard whispers ripple. She has returned. The widow of Silas Boone. She left us. Why now? Every word felt like a lash. My body wanted to fold in on itself, to shrink, to vanish. Shame pressed heavy on me, hotter than the fire I once thought would be my salvation. I had been strong in solitude only because no one had watched me fail. Here, in the open, my fragility was exposed. An elder woman reached me first. Her face was etched by years, her eyes heavy with griefs of her own. She touched my arm gently, and her voice was almost a prayer. "Eliza," she whispered, "you should not have borne this alone." Her pity seared me more than accusation would have. I pulled away, ashamed to be seen as fragile. But not all voices were kind. A man stepped forward, anger sharp in his tone. "Why now? Why return when the worst has already passed? You abandoned us, and now you come as if nothing has changed." His words struck true because they mirrored my own doubts. Had I returned for redemption or simply because solitude had broken me? My lips parted to defend myself, but no sound came. What could I say that would erase absence, that would silence truth? Pride froze my tongue, and shame anchored my silence. It was Yahola who spoke, his voice deep and even. "She kept the fire," he said, "not for herself alone, for this moment." His words hung heavy in the air. The whispers dulled. The crowd shifted, divided between those who nodded slowly and those who turned away in doubt. But none spoke further. Yahola had cut through their suspicion with a truth larger than defense. Survival is never wasted if it brings you back to the circle. The villagers opened space, and I stepped forward, trembling, toward the great fire at the center. Its flames rose higher than mine had ever burned alone. The heat pressed against my skin, not as punishment, but as invitation. For the first time since Silas's fall, I felt warmth that belonged not to one, but to many. I knelt, my hands extended, and for a brief moment, I believed in belonging again. The fire was no longer my burden. It was ours. Yet even as I surrendered to its warmth, I felt it, the shadows. They lingered at the edges of the firelight, carried in narrowed eyes, in folded arms, in whispers that refused to die. Not all welcomed me. Not all forgave my absence. In every circle of firelight, there are shadows, and some shadows feared me. Some wanted me gone. But in every circle of firelight, there are shadows, and some feared my return. Just as I began to heal, new enemies rose beyond the trees. The village fire burned stronger with each passing night. Laughter returned. Stories rose. Faces softened. For a fleeting time, I let myself believe I had stepped back into a life that could hold me. But survival does not grant peace for long. Danger has its own rhythm, and it beat against the edges of our world with growing force. It began with whispers. Traders who passed through carried uneasy tales, camps forming beyond the river, men with hunger in their eyes and weapons in their hands. Hunters returned with reports of tracks too large, too many, too close. Smoke was seen rising in the distance where no home should be. Livestock disappeared, and arrows, crude but sharp, appeared lodged in trees near the border. Fear spread like frost. It crawled across conversations, crept into dreams, sharpened the edges of daily work. Around the communal fire, voices lowered, and every ember seemed to leap higher, as though warning us that the time for endurance was nearing trial. When the attack came, it was not announced. Dawn broke, pale and cold, and with it came screams. Raiders burst from the tree line, swift and merciless, their torches setting huts ablaze, their blades flashing in firelight. The border we thought held was gone in an instant, devoured by chaos. My body froze at first. Instinct told me to hide, to shield myself, to survive silently as I always had. But something deeper pushed forward Silas Boone's memory, the weight of his burdens, the grind he had carried. It rose inside me not as grief, but as strength. For the first time, I understood what it meant to carry him forward, not as a wound, but as a weapon. I gathered children, herded them to safety, shouted commands I never thought my voice could carry. I lifted what I could, defended where I must. Fear still clawed at me, but it did not paralyze, it sharpened. My body ached, but it did not break. Every action became redemption, for the nights I had hidden, for the silence I had mistaken as strength, for the pride that had nearly killed me. Yahola was everywhere. His presence cut through the raiders like a storm, not wild but precise, each strike purposeful, each step grounded in history deeper than fear. He steadied the defenders, rallied the hesitant, and with every movement reminded us that survival was not chaos but command. His calm in battle felt like fire itself, dangerous, consuming, but necessary. Beside him, I discovered a version of myself I had never known. Not the woman who whispered to flames in solitude, but one who stood, who commanded, who carried Silas's burdens and made them my own. Pride no longer kept me from others. It fueled me to stand among them. The battle stretched into hours. Smoke filled the sky. Screams bled into silence, and blood stained the snow. When at last the raiders broke and vanished into the trees, the village stood scarred but alive. Fires smoldered in ruins, but the communal flame still rose, unbroken, fierce, unyielding. I stood before it, my chest heaving, blood mine and not mine staining my hands. My body shook, but not with fear, with revelation. I was not the same woman who had left, nor the one who had hidden. The fire had tested me, and in battle, it had remade me. And when the fire roared in battle, I was no longer the woman who once only fed it. The rider who carried the command now carried a wound. I saw it first as a dark shine beneath the leather where the arrow had bitten, a stubborn glint of blood that refused the cold. And though the battle had receded into a stunned quiet and the village stood in that fragile space where victory feels like a borrowed breath, Yahola swayed as if the earth had tilted under him, and I knew with a certainty that startled me that the balance of our endurance had shifted, because the man whose presence had steadied my nights and braced my fear now leaned toward the edge where strong bodies falter, and there was no one between him and the fall except me. I do not remember dropping to my knees so quickly. only the way my fingers found the haft of the arrow and the heat that pulsed from the wound as if a second fire had been kindled under his skin. And I do not remember calling for water, for cloth, for the old woman with hands that had stitched a lifetime of broken flesh. Only the stillness in Yahola's eyes as he said, not in protest but in permission, that the arrow must come out clean and the blood must tell its story. And I wondered if this, too, was part of the command he carried, that endurance demanded we face pain without ceremony, that survival spoke most truthfully when breath grew thin and pride fell quiet. He would not lie down at first. He said the earth would take him if he gave it the chance, and I heard in that refusal a superstition older than the village, older than my grief, a memory of ancestors who slept sitting so storms would not claim them. And I pressed him toward the pallet by the hearth anyway, because the fire we had defended roared now with a kind of defiance, and I needed its heat as much as he did. And when he finally lowered himself and exhaled in that single long release that tells you a warrior has decided to trust another's hands, I felt the tremor that ran through him shudder straight into me, as if our bones had been lashed to the same beam. The arrow had gone in high and rearward, tearing a path that would demand patience to heal and humility to bear, and I knew he would have chosen either without argument. Yet I could not ignore the way my own hands shook, not with fear of blood or flesh, but with the knowledge that in this room roles had reversed without permission. The caretaker I had been for a man already gone had become a warrior that morning, and the warrior who had drawn danger away from our doors now needed soft hands and steady breath to keep him anchored to the living. And I understood then that endurance is not a single shape, that it shifts like flame, that it assigns us new names when the wind changes. I worked in the quiet that falls after battle, that heavy quiet where children sleep with soot on their faces, and the old sit with their prayers unfinished, and I asked for a knife, for boiled water, for the thread that bites and binds, and I asked Yahola to hold to the fire with his eyes and nowhere else, because if he looked at me my hands would fail, and he obeyed with that impossible steadiness that had angered me when he first stepped from the tree line, the steadiness of a man who has been taught to greet pain like an instructor rather than an enemy. And when the arrow came free with a wet sound and a surge of blood, he closed his eyes only long enough to find the memory he needed to keep from drifting, and I felt my own breath synchronize with his, a strange, fierce tether. Hours lengthened into a single held moment. I washed, stitched, bound, and when the work of hands was done, the work of presence began, because wounds do not seal without a witness, and he fought the fever as men do, silent at first, then with sudden murmurs that were not words but directions addressed to the dark, and I learned the shape of his endurance from the inside, how he measured time by the creak of the rafters and the roll of embers, how he refused to grant pain a language even when sweat salted his brow and his jaw locked against a groan, and I realized that the command endure together had always included this, to stand guard at the edge for the one who could not stand, to feed the fire while another fought a battle no eye could see. I slept in pieces, head against the hearth, waking to the small sounds that track a healing body breath that grows shallow then steadies, the restless shift of a shoulder testing the bandage, the low hum of a dream returning to ground. And in those fragments of sleep I found no romance, because romance is a luxury of leisure and we had none, only a growing closeness built from the geometry of necessity, the quiet intimacy of shared effort, the wordless recognition that trust can live where declarations have no place. And if my hand sometimes lingered at his wrist to count the pulse, if his gaze sometimes lifted to meet mine when pain lessened and a human need for witness returned, it was not promise and not illusion, only the simple admission that survival had braided our days. By the second night he could sit, though the motion pulled a shadow across his face that I refused to name, and he asked, in that absent way of men who carry maps in their bones, whether the border watches were tight, whether the boys understood to follow the wind and not their fear, whether the women had dry stores set for 3 nights should the smoke rise again. And I marveled that a man half claimed by fever could still map our safety with better precision than those of us uninjured. And I realized that his trial was not only in the flesh, but in the patience demanded of a leader while others carry his weight. I told him of small victories to hold him to us the way the children had fed kindling to the communal fire as if they were paying a debt of courage, the way the elder had stood with her old knife and frightened a boy into dropping his fear, the way the men who doubted my return now deferred without words when I approached with tasks. And in telling him these things I heard how the village had already begun to bend around the command he brought, how our center had become a circle rather than a single back bent to the load, and I knew that if he lived, this winter would be remembered not for the scars it left but for the shape it taught us to become. On the 3rd morning he asked for the bow, and I laughed, not with mockery but with the hard humor survival permits. And when he met my eyes without smiling, I understood that this was not pride speaking, but a man's need to measure his returning strength against a simple instrument that told the truth. And I carried the bow to him, watched the way his fingers trembled when they found the string, saw the anger in his blink when the draw stopped short, and I laid my hand over his and said nothing, because speech would have been mercy, and mercy is not always medicine. And he nodded once, acknowledging the line between will and body, and set the bow aside without argument. Before his wound healed, he bound me with an oath. He did it without ceremony, when the room was empty and the fire small and the day outside had not decided whether to grant sun or send more snow, and he spoke in the low voice he used when truth needed no witness, saying that the command he carried was not his to keep and not mine to borrow but ours to bear, and that if he were to fall before the thaw, I would promise to keep the circle unbroken, to protect the small flames and the weakest hands, to spend my stubbornness where it saved lives and not where it guarded pride, and I felt the weight of the words settle into me like a second spine, and I answered without ornament that I would. Not because I wanted vows, but because the fire had already made them in me, and he closed his eyes, satisfied, as if the arrow that had pierced him had also anchored us both to something we could no longer abandon. His last words were the same as his first: endure together. He did not speak them at death's door, because death, for now, had turned its face. He spoke them when the thaw began, and the river cracked its winter shell with a sound like old iron bending when the snow softened into the kind of mud that remembers every step, when the trees tested their buds and the air tasted briefly of green, and we stood at the edge of the village where we had once met judgment and pity, and I realized that the command had transformed from a sentence carried by one man into a grammar. Our lives now spoke without effort. I had believed endurance was the act of holding breath under water until the danger passed, but endurance, as the months taught me, was not drowning quietly. It was learning to build rafts from what floated back after the storm. It was teaching the children to lash logs and tie knots and listen for currents. It was admitting that breath shared multiplies, that strength divided returns in kind, that grief asked to sit at a larger table eats less of you each night. I began to see my old solitude not as devotion to memory but as a hunger that consumed the very thing it claimed to honor. And in that harsh clarity I forgave myself not with softness but with the fierce mercy that frees a body to work again. We rebuilt not with speed but with persistence, which is a slower courage. Men who had doubted me found me at dawn with plans sketched in ash along the ground, and I watched them realize that my hands, once clumsy with the axe, now moved with a precision learned from necessity, Women who had guarded their stores against the fear of scarcity began to measure together, and I saw how abundance is not the opposite of scarcity but the practice that starves it. Children, who had learned to huddle close to the communal fire during the worst nights, now learned to carry embers safely in little clay cups to kindling piles that would become tomorrow's warmth. And each small act felt like a sentence added to a story we were finally writing as one. Yahola walked again, not with the old ease. He would carry the arrow's memory in the cautious way. He tested his weight, but with a renewed certainty in his gaze, and there were mornings I caught him staring at the tree line as if listening for an answer, and I understood he was measuring the border not for enemies but for responsibilities. Because leadership, he told me once, is not the right to be obeyed but the promise to be last, to eat when rations thin, last to sleep when watch grows long, last to be warm when fires fail, and I believed him because I had seen him live it. The fire that had once been mine alone became the village's flame, not by decree but by tending, because flames travel the way stories travel, by breath and careful hands. We built a hearth larger than any before, wide enough for a circle that allowed no one to stand at the edge with their back to the cold, and at night the elders told the children truths that did not flatter us. How fear had sent sharp words into the open when I returned, how pride had nearly broken the circle, how hunger makes cowards of the best of us, and yet courage is not the absence of that hunger, but the refusal to feed it first. And the children, wide-eyed, learned that heroism is often only the name we give to relentless, ordinary care. I spoke little of Silas Boone because grief does not vanish when a village grows warm. It shifts shape and sits beside you with better manners. Yet I brought his memory into the work where it belonged. The sturdy frames he would have raised became the models we built to. The debts he left became the debts we forgave in others, so the ledger would not be our master. The grind he carried alone became the shared labor we divided into tasks that broke no one. And in that practical honoring I found that love need not be a shrine to be true. It can be a tool shed, a clean ledger, a stack of split wood at dusk. Forgiveness moved slowly through the village like spring melt through the furrows. And I learned that to forgive is not to forget the wound but to stop feeding it, to let the flesh learn new purpose. I forgave those who had eyed me with suspicion, and they, embarrassed by their earlier words, forgave me for absence, and in that mutual release we found a space in which future could stand. I forgave myself for mistaking isolation as loyalty, and thanked the part of me that had kept the fire anyway. Because mistakes that still save a life do not deserve to be called by only one name. We marked the passing of winter with no festival, because celebrations are easy and we needed a practice that would hold when joy thinned. Instead, we instituted a keeping. On the first night of each month, the fire would be watched by a pair, never a single, and the pair would be chosen by lot, so that friendship would not be the only rope that held us. And as the watch rotated through the village, strangers learned the hum of each other's breathing, the pattern of their fears, the jokes that could lift tired shoulders, and the law that Yahola named found a home in our bones. No one keeps the fire alone, not even when they want to. He asked me once if I resented the oath he pressed into me when fever burned him, and I answered that resentment is a seed I no longer plant, because it grows into thorns even in good soil. And he looked at me for a long time, then nodded, satisfied that the command had not merely lodged in my mouth but taken root where it could not be argued away by mood. And in that quiet I realized that our intimacy, shaped by scar and labor, had no need of vows dressed in softer cloth. We had already been bound by the work. There were still losses. Endurance does not make the world gentle. A boy broke his leg in the thaw and learned patience the hard way. A storehouse roof failed, and we rebuilt it with laughter that tasted of fatigue. A rumor drifted in that the raiders had gathered elsewhere and were learning our names, and we tightened the watches without letting fear choose our meals. Through each, the law held. We repeated it not as a chant, but as instruction: endure together, and the repetition did not empty the words. It filled them. His last words were the same as his first the day he left to carry a message to an Allied camp upriver, because commands to stay clean must be handed on before they rust, and as he mounted with that careful swing that honored the wound but did not bow to it, he looked back over the circle and then at me, and said it softly, not as an order now but as a trust: endure together. I answered not with words but with a gesture the village would come to recognize, my palm held toward the hearth as if introducing a friend, and he smiled with his eyes, turned, and rode into the line of trees that had once frightened me. And no fear rose then, only the steady warmth of a flame I no longer mistook for mine. I learned to speak to the children in the evenings the way the elders had spoken to me in grief, without decoration and without cruelty, and I told them that if one day they found themselves in a cracked city or a silent field or a room that wanted their tears more than their breath, they should look for the small light and feed it carefully, and when hands reached from the dark they should not swat them away because old pain had taught them its own habits. And if pride told them they must prove themselves alone, they should laugh at pride and give it a broom, because the floor always needs sweeping and pride always needs reminding that it is only useful when it works. So the ending did not arrive with drums or banners, because endings that hold rarely do. It arrived in the ordinary bread steaming, a blade sharpened, a sleeping child's hand uncurled from a stick of kindling, and in that ordinary, I felt the weight of the law settle at last into ease. I do not know what storms will come next, which trees will fall, which faces will leave our circle, but I know the shape we will take, because the command has made us its image, and we have consented to be remade. So long as the fire burns in my home, know it is not mine alone, it belongs to us all.